Another day, another threat to our privacy, especially when it comes to encryption. Yes, this is the FBI again here, and a recent story by Patrick Eddington. April 24th, the FBI put out a notice in the Federal Register seeking public comment on its proposal to collect data on the volume of law enforcement investigations that are negatively impacted by device and software encryption. Because of course they are. Because that's just what they do. Tellingly, the Bureau is not asking, remember, it's not just what you see, it's what you don't see, not asking state and local law enforcement agencies how many times they were able to get into cell phones, tablets, or computers, despite the presence of encrypted technology. Because this is the narrative, it's the going dark thing. You know, they want you to think that, oh, we're so helpless to do anything. We've just got to spy on people, otherwise we might be forced to do actual police work. Yeah, why don't you try that once in a while? You never know. It just might work. I mean, we know it works, right? We've known it's worked since the 19th century, so. Guess what? They didn't even have cell phones and everything else that they could look into to try and see what people were doing. They just didn't exist. So it was already dark. So now that we've got all these devices that they can potentially spy on, they want to be able to do it. So, because of course they do. But that's a false narrative, and senior FBI officials will frequently say or do something that proves it so. Like a public meeting held in 2016 at the National Academy of Sciences, FBI General Counsel James Baker acknowledged that the Bureau was able to get into locked mobile devices in its possession 87% of the time. So how is that going dark? No, they can get into them, and he goes over some examples here, and he says, even the FBI's overseas partners are having success in cracking encryption and targeting encryption service providers. In February of this year, Dutch authorities announced that they had penetrated and shut down another encrypted phone provider. Sounds like it's pretty effective to me. I mean, this is the jackboot, but that when has that ever stopped them before? Many major tech companies actually collude with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, despite ritualistic pronouncements from them about their commitment to user privacy. They're so committed. We want you to be private. And then in the back room, they're making deals with the FBI. That's how it is, people. That's how it is. Long-time viewers have heard me talk about Rihanna Pfefferkorn. She's a security researcher. And she said, given the FBI's years-long campaign against encryption, it makes a strange bedfellow to the encrypted service providers it has condemned by name in public speeches. So, in public, they're like, oh, they're horrible, they're not working with us, and then in the background there, yeah. But service providers and the FBI both benefit from a popular misconception that underestimates the user data available to investigators from certain end-to-end encryption services. That misapprehension simultaneously maintains the provider's image in the eyes of privacy-conscious users while upholding the FBI's narrative that it's going dark in criminal investigations due to encryption. And they talk about Cellebrite, who actively advertises its success in cracking encryption on Apple and Android devices. I think that's the one they used for the San Bernardino shooters. You remember they made that big deal about how they couldn't get into the iPhones? And they needed to pass this law and that law and every other law so they could get into the iPhones, and then it turned out they got into the iPhones anyway. The very existence of such services undermines the entire rationale for encryption backdoors and the FBI's new and misleading buzzword, lawful access. Yeah. Breaking encryption is now called lawful access. So that's where we are, people. Further, the FBI's obsession with undermining public key encryption has the potential to put its own agents and staff at risk. Because how do you think they communicate? They're going to be communicating using the same PKI, that's public key infrastructure, that the rest of us use. Yeah. They're doing all this crap about Julian Assange because they say, oh, he put our agents at risk even though he didn't. And they did the same thing with Snowden. Well, here they actually are talking about doing things that will put their own agents at risk. So, all right, you've also heard me talk about Moxie Marlinspike. He created the encryption for Signal. And he said in April 2021, Cellebrite's own software is vulnerable to exploitation. Hostile intelligence services or drug cartels could manipulate the software to ensure any phones captured by Cellebrite's law enforcement partners will in turn infect partners' devices. The hunters would then become the prey. The Bureau also faces fundamental legal and constitutional problems with trying to get Congress to help it compromise public key encryption. He mentions the 1999 decision, Bernstein v. DOJ, and you've heard me talk about Dan Bernstein before, Daniel J. Bernstein. He's a cryptographer who's just made so many of the algorithms that we use and depend on. And this was back in the 90s. Back the first time we fought this fight and won, by the way. So here we are doing it all over again. The DOJ declared that his algorithms, and not just his, but other algorithms like RSA, were munitions. And in particular, you weren't allowed to export them, and it was just like code. And some of these were short enough that they could fit on a t-shirt, and people were doing things like wearing t-shirts and going through the international airports and going through customs and all that. Hey, we're exporting munitions. Oh boy, because it's speech. And it is the Ninth Court of Appeals upheld district court rulings that said attempts by the Department of State and Commerce to require licensing of encryption software represented an unconstitutional prior restraint on a professor's speech, in effect ruling that code equals speech. As opposed to 2600 v. Universal or MPAA v. 2600, MPAA v. Corley, whichever way that went. That one, you've heard me talk about that before. Judge Lewis A. Kaplan. Yes, the same Lewis A. Kaplan that's running that, Trump circus up in New York. And he's always been like that. If you've been following the Trump civil trial and you're wondering what the hell is up with that judge, he's always been like that. Every time he gets a case to where he has to bow to his corporate masters, he does it with glee. So in that case, they ruled the code wasn't speech. Lewis Kaplan did. And so, to prove it was, I wrote the computer code hoedown, and I got kicked off of mp3.com. As far as I know, that was the first example of being canceled. It wasn't just me. Other people were doing the same thing, and other activists were doing other things to demonstrate that code is speech. It's how computer programmers talk to each other. It's how we get these algorithms in front of each other's eyes. Computer code is not meant for a computer to read. A computer cannot read computer code, source code, that's written in a high-level language like, C or whatever. You have to compile it into object code. And that object code makes that binary file, that exe file on Windows, that it can actually run. But the source code is not that. You know what? Hang on a second. I've done this demonstration before, but it's worth doing it again. Hang on. This'll work. It's dirty and it's messed up. It's over the years, but one of my favorites, the Blue Danube Waltz by Johann Strauss. So, what is this? Is this music? Is this the Blue Danube Waltz? No, it isn't. It is not. It is not the waltz. It is not music. It is instructions for musicians on how to play the music. Music is something you listen to. You can't listen to this. Well, I guess the paper makes noise, but it doesn't make the Blue Danube Waltz. You have to play it. So these are your instructions. This is a form of speech. This is one musician talking to others. Johann Strauss talking to any other musicians who might be interested in playing his little waltz. Instructions on how to do it. So this is speech. So computer code is the same way. So, sorry about that. Just had to get resituated. But yeah, it's the same kind of thing here. Computer code is, you see this all the time. You just go on GitHub and, someone posts code and people are commenting on it. What about this? What about that? Oh no, I make changes to it. I think this is different, so I'll make a pull request for it. And then what happens? Well, that has to be compiled into the actual executable that you download and run. So that's how it works. Code is speech. And they try to keep denying it, but this ruling, Bernstein v. DOJ, specifically referred to the source code underpinning encryption software. Of course, so did MPAA v. Corley, because it was the DRM that had been written. They were trying to make a DVD player for the Linux operating system, which meant that they had to decrypt the DRM, and it was broken by a 15-year-old kid in Norway. That's to let you know how it is. But they couldn't touch him because he was in Norway. They were in the U.S. So instead, they got Eric Corley, publisher of 2600 magazine, and he had published the source code and given links to it. And man, they just trashed him in court over that. That was absolutely ridiculous. It was a magazine. That itself is proof that code is speech. So anyway. Government attempts to statutorily mandate encryption backdoors involves forcing encryption service providers to build products that are, by definition, defective, creating an inherent liability risk that would not be borne out by the government, but by the encryption product and service providers. Setting aside questions of the legality of such legislation, if it were passed and actually upheld by federal courts, an encryption product company / service provider might elect to cease operations rather than run the risk of unwinnable consumer lawsuits under prevailing product liability laws. We're seeing the same thing right now with cryptocurrency. A lot of these cryptocurrency companies, they're leaving the U.S. in droves because the SEC has gone completely crazy and just think they can make up whatever the law is, just like the ATF is doing, just like the FBI is doing, just like so many others in the Biden administration. And yeah, that's the rule of men, not the rule of law. And even things like basic exchanges that they said long ago were not securities. All of a sudden they're securities. Or like, as libraries pointed out, they say, oh, well, just come register. And it's like, Okay, we'd love to. Tell us how. And there's no way. They've been begging them for years. And so then they drag them into court for not registering. That's absolutely ridiculous. So, again, we see it with all of these. This is not about protecting you. It's not about protecting the children from child abuse material and all this. No. No, it's not. Of course it's not. I mean, I don't even feel like going into it because I just feel like it's too obvious. How is it not blindingly obvious to anyone who isn't a complete, true believer for the cult of Joe Biden? The loss of public key encryption service providers would make us all more vulnerable, both physically and financially. Hate to break it to you, Eddington, but that's kind of the point. The notion that such backdoors could be kept safe in government or even corporate hands doesn't pass the laugh test. I love this part. Patrick Eddington, this is a good one. This is a quotable quote. Write this one down. There are only two kinds of IT systems on this planet. Those that have been breached and those that will be breached. That's it. That's it. Security people have always said this. Is like, is my system vulnerable? Is there a way in? We don't even need to look at it. Yes, there's a way in. The only question is, how long would it take? How long would it take someone to casually get in? How long would it take someone determined to get in? But, go back to the 80s, Commodore 64, Amiga, Apple II, all those. Oh my God. I'll tell you, the only barrier to get into that is getting the hardware. But if you can get the hardware, it's just easy to get in. So, the encryption they were talking about in the 90s, yeah, we're going through that now. We've got a lot more advanced encryption, which is why the algorithms have to keep changing. They have to keep making newer and better algorithms. So he says, it is difficult enough to write secure code or otherwise keep cyber attackers at bay without deliberately injecting vulnerabilities into the coding process. And he mentions the Office of Personnel Management. We talked about that. Department of Energy, LastPass. We talked about all of those. Equifax is another big one where, and the problem with that, of course, is none of us have a choice as to what we had a choice of whether to give LastPass our information. We didn't have a choice about whether to give Equifax or Experian, because I think they had a big one too. All of these places, all these big places, all these government places getting hacked. And they want us to trust them. And again, I have to say, Boston Marathon, the Paris shooting, all of those, they weren't able to stop them, even though when they planned it out, they didn't use encrypted services at all. They just used basic social media that wasn't even encrypted. How about you show us that you can take care of it when they don't use encryption? We need to spy on it to prevent it. Well, you're not preventing it even when they're not encrypting. So. And as he points out, I've said this before, the American founders used encryption. Thomas Jefferson invented the wheel cipher. I showed that to you. Cool little wheel cipher. Sending secret messages, incorporating codes only they knew. I mean, they were committing treason after all. So. If the founders thought public use of encryption was at odds with other principles of the Constitution, they would have included a ban on it or a lawful access provision in the Fourth Amendment. They didn't. Yeah, so stop this. Oh, the founding fathers didn't know about it. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Just like the anti-gun nutbards. Oh, the founders didn't know about repeating rifles. Yeah, they did. Oh, the founders didn't know about machine guns. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Oh, they didn't know about larger weapons. Yeah, they did. They had cannons. Shut up. And I don't even know what kind of argument that is anyway. They had these things. They knew about them. They used them themselves. And they still put these, just like they knew about epidemics and pandemics, because they lived through one every 5 or 10 years, another one will blow through, and they still guaranteed our right to peaceably assemble. Without any exception for an epidemic or a pandemic. They knew. They knew. They understood all of this. If Congress abets the FBI's quest to destroy public key encryption in an effort to solve a discrete number of crimes, it will only make us all, including law enforcement officers and their families, remember that, because they got to use these services too. Online banking. How are they going to do online banking? E-commerce. Oh, we got through the pandemic and the lockdowns by getting everything from Amazon, right? Well, if that's not secure, and we're depending on that, including them and their families, we were all dependent on this. It just makes us all more vulnerable to a vastly greater range of crimes in the future. That's a trade-off none of us can afford. Thank you, Patrick Eddington. Yep. Eternal vigilance. We won the fight back in the 90s, and we're having to fight it again now, 20 years later. 25, something like that. Yep. You win, and then you have to fight it again, and that's how government is, and that's how it's always going to be. And that's what you need to keep in mind. Every time you fight, every time you win, you'll just have to do it again. Unless we actually stick to our principles and finally realize the government itself is unethical and should not be tolerated, cannot be trusted, and just is not any part of civilization. It's what's holding us back. All these problems they claim to solve, we can solve them better on our own. We don't need them. We never needed them. So that's always the lesson, isn't it? Underpinning all of these videos. Every single one of them. You think it through logically, that's the only conclusion you can really come to. So thank you so very much for watching. Comments for the comment god, shares for the share throne. Please hit like, subscribe, and the bell, and go to donate.bogosity.tv to keep me doing what I do. And please consider becoming a regular supporter on Patreon and Subscribestar. Get all my videos early and ad-free. And there's there's an AMA every month, which I have to do, by the way. I know I'm late on it. Just everything was crazy like the last week or so. I'm getting to it. I promise. The AMA is coming. You can go ahead and ask questions for next month, and shout outs and other things as well. So check all of that out. Thank you very much. Until next time, stay strong and be free.